Gentlemen, it's been phenomenal, and there's a reason why Vishwamitra has also become Vishwa Mantra, that is, has provided the Vishwa Mantra of Sabka Saath. This whole aspect of illusion is something the Prime Minister has been able to work. Look at what's been achieved. Let's try and first understand the Africa Union. 55 nations become permanent member, and it's all happened, the process happened in just 1 year. So from India's chair, this entire continent has now been connected with the entire G20 grouping. It becomes G21, literally 19 nations plus EU plus AU. 100% consensus on geopolitical issues. Not a single paragraph of the 38-page long New Delhi declaration had a footnote or an objection. It's been totally agreed on. Consensus on wording of the Ukraine war passage. Biofuel alliance that was mooted by Brazil. So you got Brazil, the US. We also have nations like Bangladesh. 19 nations already are signatories for the World Biofuel Alliance. There'll be more coming on board very, very soon. Prime Minister Narendra Modi getting Joe Biden and, of course, MBS, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to shake hands. So that ice has been broken. And that was a significant moment. The selfie moment between Joe Biden and Sheikh Hasina, that also because Bangladesh equations with the US, especially the Biden administration, been very, very frosty, and that's seen a thaw. The economic corridor and the Trans-Africa Highway. So it's not just India all the way to Europe that's going to be linked via Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and the UAE, but you're also going to have a Trans-Africa Highway which is going to be built, and at zero cost to India. Economic corridor, Italy to exit the BRI. So clearly, this BRI, Italy is going to exit and join this routing and this combination. Big significant achievement. Japan then comes out and says, Japan comes out and says, we are not already helping India. We want to help build this infrastructure, and we want to say in it too. We want to get on board. Detailed paragraphs and also definition of terror. Clearly, if you read, Professor Salvatore Babuno is saying China has literally thrown Pakistan under the bus in the way it's been worded. So many achievements. Let's go straight across to our guest this evening. Professor Brahma Chelani is with us, strategic affairs expert. Ambassador Kamal Sibal is with us, and Andrew K.P. Leung also with us. Good evening. Thank you very, very much. Ambassador Kamal Sibal, how would you see, have you perused the New Delhi declaration? And if you look back over the last 48 hours, how would you rate India's presidency, sir?
I think Amitabh Kant has already given you all that needed to be said about how we handled the G20 presidency and the results that we have succeeded in achieving. So there is nothing more that one can add to what has been said by someone who actually was in the forefront of negotiations and in contact with all the parties concerned in building up consensus. Having said that, I think it is very clear that I'll just mention that the West, led by the United States, decided to become softer in their position on the Ukraine issue because they realized that if they did not, then it would be possible to get a summit document. And if that didn't happen, then the future of the G20 itself would be perilled. And then with President Biden in Delhi, and seeking to reinforce further ties with India could cause embarrassment to Prime Minister Modi and to India, that despite his presence and the fact that our relations are beginning to be so much closer, actually did not help India at a critical moment, and prevented India from gaining maximum mileage out of something on which they had expended so much capital, so much attention. So I think to that extent, the West has been constructive, the Americans have been constructive. That's one. The other is that Russians have achieved a very considerable diplomatic success. The word Russia is not mentioned at all in the document. And whatever has been said is in terms of general principles, and while indirectly one can say that in some instances Russia is targeted, but the Russians can easily say that these are general principles and they apply to everyone, that sort of a thing. But Russia definitely has emerged very successful from this conference diplomatically. China has been in the shadows because Xi Jinping did not come. The Prime Minister of China did not have any visibility as I can see. But China too has played a constructive role in that sense. But they had no choice. Once Russia is on board, then China's policy is to support Russia. So they have gone along, and some of the objections they raised to Vasudev Kutumban and all those things that Amitabh mentioned, that has appeared in the press. To my mind, it was childish. It was childish. But nevertheless, we were able to get through our ideas and our slogans and what have you, in terms of our thoughts on how the world community should interact with each other, Vasudev Kutumban and all that, that has gone in. That is the third thing. The fourth is that this corridor that has been announced is important potentially. Because, Saudi Arabia and UAE have tremendous plans for economic development, their 2030 vision, which will demand a lot of creation of huge amounts of infrastructure, especially in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia wants to have, and UAE wants to have food corridors with India. They want to have, especially UAE, more ties with India. We have a FTA. So there is tremendous prospect there. And in terms of connectivity, this is an alternative to what China is doing in terms of connecting itself to the Europe and to the rest of the world. In fact, that project has run into trouble because China's relations with the West, especially with the EU, and not especially, but with the EU too, has become much more difficult, and countries are walking out of the 17+1 dialogue that China was holding. Is now going to off from the BRI. So it's a good moment for us in terms of connectivity to develop this alternative connectivity. And finally, I would say, and I'll sum up, that I think the West and G7 are worried that BRICS is gathering steam. And already it's become G11 at the next summit in Russia. It might actually expand further. And here is a group in which there is no Western presence. So their agenda is not influenced by Western thinking and priorities. They want to have a more democratic and equitable world, international order. Whereas in the G20, there is both the G7 plus as well as developing countries, the global South. So this is important for the G7 plus, that they should have inroads into the global South, emerging groups, emerging countries, so that the field is not left clear for Russia and China to develop BRICS as an alternative model to what the West has been actually doing this year. So I think in that sense, they realized what they needed to do in terms of making this a success. And finally, the last word. In fact, they have helped Prime Minister Modi a lot and India a lot in facilitating the issuance of this document. Because it would have otherwise dented a little bit India's prestige, India's capacity to bring everybody together, because our entire policy is based on the fact that we are friends with everyone and we keep doors open with everyone. So in that sense, I think India's position as a player on the international stage has been strengthened by this success.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of conversations that were had on the sidelines of the BRICS summit also in South Africa, which seem to have made a lot of progress towards the declaration. But Andrew K.P. Leung, if I may ask you before I bring in Brahmachalani, do you believe there will be a recalibration in approach by the CCP? Because even as there is the joint New Delhi declaration that comes to the fore, there are reports which have been put out in the Nepalese media that there is heightened activity along the LAC by the PLA. So you talk peace and you walk war. Is that going to continue, or do you believe there will be a recalibration on the way China looks at this region and also India?
You don't think that Beijing would link the G20 in their success on a G20 summit with the border disputes? That is extremely childish. But I don't think that this is going to happen. Both leaders, President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, have recently agreed to de-escalate. I don't think that this agreement could be derailed by China's perception of India's success on the G20. I think the two are entirely separate. Now, as far as the perceived challenge to the China's Belt and Road is concerned, I don't think there's any question of alternative. Don't forget, the reality remains that China is the largest trading partner, not India. China is the largest trading partner to 128 countries around the world, well ahead of the United States, let alone India. So this fact is not going to be changed by building a rail and sea link with India and Middle East and Europe. And how much can India trade with Europe or Europe trade with India? That's the main question. I think that the most important thing is that China welcomes this global connectivity, because after world, China embraces globalization, because globalization trade is China's lifeblood. Now, as far as the G20 statement is concerned, I think the most important thing is to implement it. There's a lot of talk about a lot of money involved in building the link. How this is going to be financed is also important, but also the reform of the international lending system, as highlighted earlier, and to which China would definitely play a part. Now, the other implication is that, of course, since the Belt and Road was first invented by China, actually, because there was that obvious lack of infrastructural connectivity. And as of now, 10 years down the line, I think China's Belt and Road is now taking stock of the achievement so far. And I use the word achievement because there is already $1 trillion already invested. And then something like 40 million people around the world have been lifted out of poverty because of China's Belt and Road initiative. Obviously, there are lots of blowback in terms of perceptions of lack of transparency or some countries' indebtedness. I think China's taking the stock all along. So I think the whole process would be constructive for China as well as the rest of the developing world.
Here's the thing, Andrew and Ramaji, please weigh in on this. This economic corridor is a committee of nations. It's not the hegemony of one particular nation and its agenda. And there is no debt trap involved. Brahmachalani, is that the biggest difference? And why do you think this could work and this could hurt China's interests? Because Andrew believes China is not going to get hurt. Connectivity and the world connecting is only going to help because China always has worked towards globalization. Whereas many believe that this is going to hurt China's interests in the long term.
The problem with China's lending is opacity. China is very opaque. In fact, it's pretty predatory in terms of its lending practices. China has become the world's largest sovereign creditor to developing countries. But if you look at its loan contracts, almost every Chinese loan contract issued in the last decade has included a sweeping secrecy clause compelling the borrowing country not to disclose the terms of the loan.
Right.
In fact, some of the contracts even stipulate that even the existence of the loan should not be disclosed. The result is that many African, Asian, and Latin American countries have become ensnared in a debt trap, leaving them highly vulnerable to Chinese pressure to pursue policies that advance Chinese economic and geopolitical interests. So to counter that, one of the outcomes of the G20 has been agreement to expand the lending capacities of multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the IMF. The corridor to the Middle East and Europe from India is another initiative, again designed to counter China's attempt to use its lending to advance its own interests. So overall, I think if you just take the bigger picture in terms of what this summit has delivered, India kept the summit from fracturing over Ukraine. That by itself was a major accomplishment. India led the first ever expansion of the G20, is now G21. And thanks to this 37-page consensus document, which contains a host of promises by G20 member states on the pressing global issues, we finally have a document that is geared toward the future. It's a forward-looking document designed to lay the roadmap on how to deal with global challenges. The real challenge about the challenges that this document mentions is how to translate these pious commitments that are enshrined in this document into practice. Because if you look back at the G20's track record, G20 summits in the past have come up with pious commitments which have largely not been honored by member states. So we have a great forward-looking document from the New Delhi summit, but the real test would be to implement these commitments. That's the reason why Prime Minister Modi has suggested that there should be a virtual summit of the G20 in November, because India hands over the presidency to Brazil on November 30th. So before the handover, Modi has proposed a virtual summit to take stock of how the commitments made in the New Delhi Declaration are being implemented.
True, but Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, the actionables in this, are they realistic? Are they deliverable? We heard Amitabh Kant say that in November there's going to be another virtual session to look at the deliverables before India's chair or India's presidency or tenure comes to an end.
You see, the immediate challenge before us was to have a successful G20 and promote the interests, expectations, concerns of the global South. The G20 was created by the G7 and it has been dominated by the G7 all this while. It's for the first time that a very decisive push in favor of the global South has been made by India, which will be followed up by Brazil and South Africa. So therefore, the agenda of the global South henceforth will have a major place in G20 discussions. The inclusion of the African Union means the strengthening of the role of the global South. After all, the European Union with 27 member states is a member, an African Union, 55 states come in, then you have a much broader spread in terms of the interests of the West and the interests of the global South and marrying them together. So in that case, in this case, India has put on the table, devised an agenda, put forth ideas which, as it was said earlier, look to the future and will result, hopefully, in having a much more balanced international order in terms of economics and politics. Now, some of the ideas that have been put forth, which are very good in terms of concepts, will take time. Take time to implement, and there will be challenges ahead. So what we have decided in terms of this corridor through Saudi Arabia, etc., probably get implemented, but it's not for tomorrow. A lot of discussions will lie ahead in terms of the modalities of it and the general implementational problems that we always have. Even in terms of climate change issues and finance and everything, in the current context when the global economy is facing recession, Europe is in trouble, the United States is not doing too well, China also is not doing too well. Where will this money come from? Countries are becoming much more selfish, much more inward oriented, and they're imposing all kinds of restrictions in terms of sharing of technology and everything else. So we have to work in that environment. And then finally, and this is the point that I think is important, that so long as there is a sharp division in the world between US and Europe and China and Russia, multilateralism will not work. Will not work. They can agree on certain things, but the implementation part is going to be very difficult unless there's dialogue and diplomacy and an understanding where the common interests are. But if finance is weaponized, if sanctions, unilateral sanctions are imposed and relations are interfered, relations of third countries are interfered with because of the geopolitics and of certain countries, then we're not going to have that kind of an international atmosphere where we can work together. Finally, in terms of Africa, India has long ties with Africa. China has a very big presence United States has begun to pay far more attention to Africa. Europe is losing ground, therefore they want to pay much greater attention to Africa. So everybody is agreed on the importance of Africa, and therefore it went through very quickly and rightly so that Africa will have more say. But it's a slightly delicate point. Now, if India wants to have the leadership of the global South,
Ji.
and what would be the role of the African Union? Because, the South African president has been very active in terms of carving out a leadership role for himself. He went all the way to Russia and Ukraine to try and broker a kind of a solution.
Everybody needs to try, but if the spirit is of healthy competition or collaborative competition or cohesion, then it would work. The larger question is reforms of the UN, UNSC and UN. Will these nations who hold the veto power allow that? And is there enough and more pressure, or perhaps will nations de-link from the erstwhile UN and form something totally different of their own? We'll have to wait and watch. I've run out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time on this Sunday.